Good morning. Welcome to ACCR's webinar about AGL's 2025 Climate Transition Action Plan. I'll begin by acknowledging the traditional elders of the land from which I'm dialing in, the Gujunbara people, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Just moving to some brief housekeeping. Next slide, please. You can submit questions at any time during the presentation using the Zoom Q&A function. And we will save all the questions until the end and respond to as many as we have time for. Of course, if you have any further questions, or if you aren't joining the webinar live, we'd be happy to talk further, so please feel free to contact us. AGL is Australia's largest corporate emitter and its largest energy generator, and therefore its actions and influence outlined in this CTAP fundamentally shape the pace and ambition of Australia's energy transition. When we look back to the previous CTAP in 2022, it was the product of a company in crisis and a board in a state of collapse. While it made a significant new commitment to close coal plants earlier than previously slated, the chosen pathway for its Scope 1 and 2 emissions was not aligned with the Paris Agreement, and for that reason and others, nearly 31% of the register voted against the 2022 CTAP, which was the third worst Say on Climate vote on record. And in fact, given the state of the company's leadership in 2022, ACCR had actually recommended the company take a further 12 months to develop a more considered CTAP that it could more confidently present to investors. So, as we turn to the 2025 CTAP, this is an opportunity for the new board and management team who've bedded in after 3 years to now put their stamp on AGL's role in Australia's energy transition. With the company's size and market influence, both in electricity and in gas retail, it is in a prime position to capitalise on opportunities in the transition if it wants to. But with its legacy of coal plants, the temptation is always there to sweat the assets and favour a slow transition rather than one based on the urgent scientific imperative to reduce emissions or respond to the rapidly changing policy and energy landscape. AGL CTAP is therefore of relevance to all investors and of particular concern to universal owners and to investors interested in macro stewardship too. ACCR has done a thorough assessment of the CTAP, which you can find on our website. I encourage you all to look at that in detail, and you're also welcome to meet with us one-to-one if you have any questions. Please do get in touch. The science, technology and policy landscape has changed very significantly since 2022, and weighing up all of these factors, ACCR's analysis suggests that AGL CTAP misses some key opportunities to accelerate decarbonisation and to position the company optimally in the energy transition in this rapidly changing policy and market landscape. Furthermore, the 2025 CTAP fails to address the weaknesses of the previous plan. It maintains only modest ambition, and it lacks the clear plans and targets that give investors confidence that AGL is truly maximising its market-leading position. In today's webinar, we're going to cover AGL's Scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions, as well as its targets and CapEx. Then we'll look at AGL's use of scientific scenarios, its alignment to the Paris Agreement and its use of offsets. Finally, we will assess AGL's remuneration incentives for delivering the CTAP and its policy advocacy, which is a critical enabler of its decarbonisation plans. So without further ado, I will pass over to ACCR analyst Isaac Pang, followed by ACCR's chief scientist, Dr. Dimitri Lafleur. Over to you, Isaac.
Thanks, Tom. So before we get into the detail, just a quick overview of AGL's emissions profile. AGL remains Australia's largest corporate greenhouse gas emitter. Its Scope 1 and 2 emissions come almost entirely from wastewater and Loy Yang A, which together account for 95% of the total. So that's more than half of AGL's overall emissions, which is why their closure timelines are so critical. The remaining 43% comes from Scope 3. So with that in mind, let's look at the closure dates first. AGL's coal closure dates are largely unchanged, with Loy Yang A's closure remains by the end of FY35. And for wastewater, it has chosen the latest possible date within the previous disclosed 2030 to 2033 range. So closing by December 2033 instead of 2030 at an estimated 42 million tons of CO2. This was calculated assuming January 2030 closure and using AEMO's step change capacity factors for black coal plants. And 42 million tons of CO2 is equivalent to keeping over 9 million so 9 million cars on the road for a year. And by choosing the latest date, AGL signals to the market that new replacement renewables don't need to be delivered earlier, which slows investment momentum. Basewater is already becoming less reliable as it ages, with rising unplanned outages. Keeping it until 2033 risks worsening reliability in New South Wales. This decision comes at a time when Australia is falling behind the investment pace needed to reach 82% renewables by 2030. So while Basewater's delay already pushes out emissions cuts, AGL's new Scope 1 and 2 interim targets also weaken near-term ambition. AGL's new Scope 1 and 2 interim targets are weak. They allow emissions to rise from today's levels and undermine the credibility of the transition. The company is now targeting a 17% cut by FY26 and 19% for FY27 to 34. But in FY25, AGL had already cut emissions by 29% from its baseline. That leaves 4 to 5 million tons of headroom over the next decade, meaning emissions could rise above today's levels. We recognize that coal generation may vary as other coal plants close and new renewables come online. But this flexibility signals weak urgency and undermines credibility. AGL also flagged a possible 2-year extension of Torrens Island B, which could add 2.5 million tons more into the atmosphere. So beyond coal closures, AGL plans to rely on offsets for residual emissions, mainly from gas generation, to achieve net zero for Scope 1 and 2 emissions. So that's Scope 1 and 2. So these weak interim targets raise broader concerns about AGL's overall decarbonization ambition and investment strategy. While the company continues to emphasize its 12 gigawatt new renewables and firming capacity target, questions remain about whether this ambition and the capital allocation behind it is sufficient or transparent enough to support a credible transition. AGL's 12 gigawatt renewables and firming target is modest for a company of its size, and its capital allocation lacks transparency. The 12 gigawatt target is largely unchanged. The interim 2030 target has only been lifted slightly from 5 gigawatts to 6 gigawatts, which is just a commitment to build some of it sooner. This represents only about 14% of the new capacity the NAM needs, modest for the NAM's largest generator, whose share has already fallen from 26% in 2019 to 15% today. The target also includes gas firming capacity, but AGL hasn't disclosed how much, so it's unclear how much of this is actually clean capacity. And on the positive side, AGL has committed to at least 3 gigawatts of grid-scale batteries by 2030, with another 900 megawatt close to FID, showing some near-term investment in clean firming. AGL plans to fund $10 billion on its balance sheet, heavily weighted towards firming assets. In the short term, it is prioritizing short-duration batteries, while longer term, it's looking at long-duration firming assets, like gas peakers, long-duration batteries, pumped hydro, and other technologies. Unlike peers such as Origin, which separate clean energy and gas peaking in their capital allocation outlooks, AGL does not break down how much capital goes to gas versus clean firming. This makes it difficult to assess whether its capital allocation aligns with its decarbonization pathway. On top of that, AGL expects to spend $400 to $500 million per year on sustaining coal plants, which is already rising and expected to increase further as coal plants age. This risks diverting capital away from accelerating renewables and clean firming investments. So that's AGL's 12 gigawatt target and capital allocation plan. AGL faces significant risk of losing market share over the coming years as its coal plants ramp down generation and retire. So greater ambition on renewables and clean firming isn't just about cutting emissions. It's a way to protect their market share, ensure system reliability, and demonstrate to investors that its capital allocation is aligned with Australia's energy transition. AGL needs to disclose more detail on the types of technologies behind its 12 gigawatt target, because capacity alone doesn't tell us much. So different technologies deliver very different output. For example, gas peakers may only run less than 10% of the year, while batteries may run about 20%. Without this detail, investors can't tell what kind of business AGL intends to be in 10 years, or how its strategy really supports the transition. This is therefore an important topic for investors to engage with AGL. Let's now turn to Scope 3, where AGL has announced a new interim target. AGL has set a new 60% reduction target by the end of FY35, which is a positive step, but it's driven mostly by Loy Yang Mine's closure, with little detail on how the rest will be achieved. So 60% reduction equals about 15 million tons of CO2, and around 10 million tons of that comes from the closure of Loy Yang Mine, which has been brought forward from FY47 to FY35. And the other 5 million tons are assumed to come from other sources, including emissions from the supply of electricity and natural gas. But there's no clear plan in the CTAP for how that will actually happen. This raises the question of whether AGL is really tackling structural decarbonization, or just relying on a mine that was already slated for closure to align with Victoria's 95% renewables target. Beyond FY50, AGL plans to rely on offsets to address its remaining Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions in order to reach net zero. So while the new Scope 3 target sounds strong, it relies heavily on Loy Yang Mine's closure and leaves questions about the rest of AGL's emissions. So on the next slide, we'll dig deeper into gas and electricity supply emissions, which together make up more than half of AGL's Scope 3 footprint. AGL's CTAP lacks a credible strategy for Scope 3 emissions from gas and electricity supply. It doesn't have plans to further cut gas supply emissions, and it's unclear as to how the assumed reductions will be achieved. Gas supply emissions mainly come from the combustion of natural gas that AGL sells to its customers. The CTAP assumes a 3.5 million ton cut from this source to meet the 60% target. But AGL already achieved a 3.6 million reduction in FY25, as shown on the left chart, meaning no further cuts are planned through FY36. AGL also uses a most progressive change, a 2.6 degree scenario for its gas sales outlook, which is inconsistent with its 1.8 degree operational plan. This inflates future gas demand and emissions, and undermining credibility. Another source of Scope 3 emissions is from the electricity AGL buys from the grid and sells to its customers. The CTAP assumes a 2 million ton reduction from this source, but also admits these emissions will rise as demand grows with electrification. Yet, it offers no clear strategy to manage this increase. AGL's FY27 CER and orchestration targets are also weak, with no increase in the 300 megawatt customer assets installation target since FY23. And the 2.5 gigawatt demand side flexibility ambition covers only 8% of the CER market. The CTAP also does not quantify how coal closures or the 12 gigawatt ambition will reduce grid emissions intensity. AGL's 60% Scope 3 target is relying heavily on the Loy Yang Mine closure and assuming reductions for gas and electricity supply emissions without credible strategies to bring these emission sources down. Now, I'll hand over to our Chief Scientist, Dimitri, who will take us through AGL's use of offsets, Paris alignment, and climate scenario.
Yeah, thanks, Isaac. Yeah, so in this section, I'd like to touch on two things, offsets and Paris alignment and how transition plans relate to that. The first topic, offsets, is important because the way AGL is wanting to use offsets is not considered best practice, nor will it contribute to AGL's net zero goal. And the second, the Paris Agreement and Paris alignment, is important because alignment is claimed often, while the robustness of that claim is often questionable. So I'll start with offsets. AGL wants to be net zero by 2050. And AGL's carbon offsets policy is that it will use the offsets for up to 10% of its emissions across scope 1, 2, and 3. And AGL is eventually moving away from coal-fired power, but it will keep gas assets for electricity generation, and it will keep supplying electricity and gas to consumers. And this leads to emissions, and it claims that there is no pathway to take care of those emissions other than to offset them. Now, SBTI is one of the benchmarks that argues that offsets like nature-based solutions, avoidance credits, and offsets like that cannot be used towards a science-based target, and net zero is one of those. And one of the main reasons for that is that fossil fuel emissions need to be neutralized as long as the CO2 emissions reside in the atmosphere, which is centuries to millennia. And we credits, or projects that store carbon for a short time or have a short permanency, cannot offset fossil fuel emissions. So companies should first reduce emissions in their value chain and only use the very hard to abate or the very sticky emissions with permanent removals, effectively removing CO2 from the atmosphere. And given permanent removals are a finite resource, like any other commodity, one should think very carefully about how you use that resource. Now, ACCR has put out a paper on the role of offsets that offsets play in transition plans based on the best available science. And it clearly shows that carbon offsets have no place in reducing fossil fuel emissions in the value chain. Then on the Paris alignment, AGL's CTAP cannot be considered consistent or aligned with the Paris Agreement. The scientific community, including the IPCC, argues that a 1.8 degree scenario is not consistent with the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement contains various goals, but it doesn't stipulate how to get there or how those goals should be interpreted. And that also holds for Article 2, the temperature goal. Holding warming to well below 2 degrees and pursuing efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees does not tell you how much warming that really is, but it does provide concrete guidance. And words here matter. Well below 2 degrees is not the same thing as below 2 degrees. And key to interpretation is that there should be enough certainty that we, at all times in the 21st century, avoid 2 degrees. And a 50-50 chance is not a lot of certainty, but a 90% chance gives you a high degree of certainty that you will limit warming to a certain temperature outcome, in this case, 2 degrees. We also need to be able to get as close as possible to 1.5 in 2100, not in 2030 or 2050, but in 2100. And by allowing a higher peak temperature at some point during the 21st century, you accept a higher probability of breaching 2 degrees at some point during the 21st century, and you make it less likely to get as close as possible to 1.5 in 2100. Now, in practice, this means that scenarios that limit peak temperature to 1.6 or less have a high likelihood, more than 90%, of staying below 2 degrees and have a shot at 1.5 in 2100. There's a little bit more to this, which is Article 4.1 that talks to net zero CO2 and net zero greenhouse gases, which I won't go into. Happy to talk about it. But for these reasons, it is hard to argue that a 1.8 degrees scenario can be considered Paris aligned. And by considering scenarios with a peak temperature of 1.8 Paris aligned, You allow delays in coal closures in developed countries. You risk breaching 2 degrees at some point during the 21st century. And you close the window to limit physical impacts on assets, on society, here in Australia and anywhere else, including small island states for whom the 1.5 degree scenario is of vital importance. So what does this mean for AGL and investors? The CTAP sets AGL on track to decarbonize slower than the NEM as a whole, if we take the step change scenario as the pathway forward. It is also slower than the IEA. What the IEA suggests electricity grids in developed countries will do under any scenario. Current policies, the step scenario, the scenario that nations' targets are met, the APS, or under the Paris-aligned scenario, the NZE. And that is what you see here on the right. The bar chart shows you AGL's emissions forecast based on its plans, while the grids, those are the colored lines, either the NEM for the step change scenario or the grids in developed countries for the IEA scenarios, they all decarbonize faster. And this means that AGL's share of NEM's remaining carbon budget balloons to more than 30% by 2036, which puts a significant burden on the pace of the NEM's decarbonization. It is slowing down the decarbonization of the NEM as a whole and for gas consumers. AGL is a systemically important company, and which is why universal owners should really take note here and should be focused on forceful engagement with the company. And the last slide was very focused on electricity, but I do want to touch on something that Isaac mentioned earlier on with regards to data for gas demand. AGL is using data sets from various scenarios to support its decarbonization plan. It uses data from the IEMO's progressive change scenario for how it sees gas demand evolving, but it's using data from the step change scenario for electricity demand. And these scenarios have very different temperature outcomes. Scenarios are internally consistent. Sectors of an economy act and react very differently under scenarios with different temperature outcomes. So one cannot use data from different scenarios to substantiate a decarbonization plan and argue it is consistent with a certain temperature outcome. You're baking in emissions that are not supposed to be there, given the data from another scenario. And so, yeah, this is really contrary to best practice. ClimateWorks recently published credibility criteria for credible transition plans and reinforces this again. Plans and targets should be sufficiently ambitious and feasible for emission reductions to occur in line with the Paris Agreement. So, yeah, some food for thought here on offsets, scenarios, and alignment. And I'll hand over to Tom, who will continue with AGL's remuneration policy.
Thank you, Dimitri. So let's briefly turn to AGL's remuneration policy, which is obviously a critical piece of governance for the board to get right so that the management and the whole company is really incentivized to deliver this CTAP. And unfortunately, AGL's incentives remain fairly poorly linked to the CTAP. AGL has 3 carbon-related metrics as part of the LTI. However, all of these are really quite flawed metrics. They do not link to absolute emissions reductions, and they do not significantly align executive performance with AGL's goals outlined in the CTAP. The nature of these metrics is that executives can meet these targets without materially shifting fossil fuel operations or making structural changes or reducing absolute emissions. And one piece of evidence for that is the 0% vesting of the emissions intensity metric since its introduction, which suggests it's not effectively incentivizing meaningful emissions reductions. And from next year, AGL will be dropping the green revenue metric from the REM and increase the weighting on its new capacity metric, which perhaps reflects AGL's near-term focus on its batteries and firming pipeline. But overall, as a company so highly exposed to the energy transition, these remuneration settings signal weak internal accountability and represent a fairly concerning governance oversight. For these reasons, ACCR intends to vote against this year's remuneration report, and we would really like to see it evolve in future to ensure that it is genuinely delivering the CTAP. Turning to electrification, AGL has identified the journey of electrification as a fundamental part of the energy transition. And indeed, over the next decade or so, Australia will need not only a decarbonised electricity sector, but also substantial growth in demand around electrification to enable emissions cuts in other sectors. So AGL and electrification have a really critical role to play. So I cannot really underscore enough what a fundamental and material issue this is for AGL. As you can see in the two pie charts, AGL is currently Australia's largest gas retailer and its second largest electricity retailer. So the changing balance between gas and electrification is going to be a major feature of AGL's business model over the next decade or so, depending how fast customers take up the new technologies. So although this chart may look a little bland, what it actually shows us is perhaps the number one long-term risk in this business. And investors really need confidence that AGL is managing this long-term risk proactively. And this risk is not a what if. The changes are already happening today, as we've seen with the cheaper home batteries scheme, which has blown all expectations out of the water. And one can only assume that these changes are going to accelerate over the next decade. For example, Victoria's gas substitution roadmap, which was released in June, could accelerate electrification really dramatically in Australia's largest gas market. This is such a real and present risk that it requires investors to engage heavily on this issue. And the fundamental question is, how is AGL going to move from being the largest gas retailer to a 100% electricity generator? It's such a material issue, we would have expected this CTAP to present a clear electrification strategy with disaggregated data for the potential pace of change across households, business and industry, and with clear plans and targets and investments for the next 5 to 10 years. Not only is this important in its own right, but it would also be a vital contribution to AGL's Scope 3 target and reassure investors that that target is robust and backed by real plans. Regrettably, the CTAP has released no such strategy for electrification, and it really leaves investors in the dark about how the company is managing this long-term risk. And investors should be very concerned about AGL's lack of transparency and detail on this issue. Just turning briefly to policy, of course, AGL cannot achieve electrification on its own. It's a structural change in the economy, and many wider policies across all levels of Australia will be needed. It's imperative, therefore, that AGL be ahead of the curve on policy making on this issue. And yet, as Dimitri and Isaac have mentioned, their gas outlook and their articulated policy positions in the CTAP appear not even to have incorporated the significant new policy developments that mentioned on the slide, particularly the gas substitution roadmap, which was released about a month before the CTAP. So we strongly encourage investors to engage on this topic because it is probably the biggest long-term risk AGL faces and not one that they're addressing in the CTAP. One area where AGL has significantly improved in this CTAP is in its disclosures around lobbying. AGL has identified that policy settings are currently not sufficient to enable it to deliver the CTAP. And the policy landscape is therefore going to be a critical enabler or limiter on AGL's ability to make progress. The CTAP therefore rightly identifies that one of the most critical tools for delivering the CTAP is in fact AGL's policy advocacy at all levels of government from local to federal. And AGL has made some very welcome improvements in this area. Taking a look at the spider chart on the left, AGL offers the view that current market conditions are somewhere between scenarios 3 and 4, with the key difference being the pace of renewables build-out in the near term. One would therefore assume that AGL views changing these policy settings as its highest priority, to shift them from scenario 4 to 3 and ideally to the more highly supportive scenarios 1 and 2. Those later scenarios 1 and 2 also require a much higher adoption of electrification across many sectors. However, when we turn to the level of specificity that AGL has given about its advocacy positions, there's only a small amount of detail about its ambitions in these crucial policy areas. This shows a concerning lack of long-term thinking about the policy requirements that it needs, and some resilience testing about AGL's plans. And these policy settings between 3 and 4 also reflect that AGL has only modest ambitions for its own near-term renewables build-out, seemingly content to stay at scenario 3 rather than scale up near-term focus on renewables, which would help shift the dial to more ambitious scenarios. Looking more directly at AGL's lobbying, this is a very positive step. AGL has woken up to the reality that in Australia, many industry associations have substantial policy influence on climate and energy policies, and not all of these are lobbying in line with AGL's interests and ambitions in the CTAP. So AGL has made some very welcome commitments to address this misalignment with industry associations and to proactively seek to use these associations to help achieve its goals. Here we can see that this moves AGL on the influence map scorecard from a 1 in 2022 to a 5, which brings it into line with peers such as Origin and RWE. However, it is still falling far short of best practice compared to European peers. It can be hoped that AGL engages vigorously with these associations, such as the Business Council of Australia and the Australian Energy Council, of whom it's chair, to ensure that the policy settings enable a faster transition for everyone and for AGL itself. Despite this very welcome progress around positive advocacy, AGL can do even more to improve its advocacy and ensure it is fully aligned with the Paris Agreement goals. Critical areas of interest might be to engage on electrification across all states and territories, and to publish more frequent updates on its consultation submissions, case studies and industry associations so that investors can see the progress that's being made. It's worth noting that these improvements AGL has made this year are mostly related to disclosure and its level of ambition, but there's still not a great deal of clarity on delivery. So that would be our recommendation for where AGL could focus, and that would give investors confidence that AGL is putting the company's full weight behind the policy settings needed for Australia's energy transition. So, in conclusion, ACCR's analysis finds that AGL's 2025 CTAP is still not following a Paris-aligned pathway. The new board and management have largely rolled over the modest level of ambition in the 2022 plan, which unfortunately continues to deter investment in renewables and lack the sufficient level of transparency on its capex mix and what story the company is trying to tell over the next few years. There is a glaring failure to address one of the most fundamental long-term risks to the business as it shifts from a gas retailer to a zero-carbon electricity retailer. And throughout, despite some welcome new targets and batteries and Scope 3 emissions, it lacks the clear plans to back these up when we look more closely at the details. Furthermore, the remuneration settings are not well linked to the CTAP and don't incentivize the kinds of structural changes and emissions reductions that AGL actually needs to deliver. For these combined reasons, ACCR intends to vote against AGL's 2025 Climate Transition Action Plan and the remuneration report at the AGM on the 3rd of October this year. If you'd like further details on this and some other areas we have not covered today, please see the full CTAP analysis on our website and feel free to get in touch with us with any further questions. That concludes our presentation of AGL's 2025 Climate Transition Action Plan, and we will now move to questions. What are the biggest risks AGL faces in delivering its transition? I'll have a go at addressing that one. As we've mentioned already, one of the biggest risks is about the pace of change in electrification versus gas substitution. I won't labour that point, but it is a fairly fundamental question for the different parts of AGL's business, how the management is bringing those together or not, and addressing some of the quite challenging aspects of it. And it's also a policy settings risk there. No one's quite sure how fast or slow electrification is going to go. There's certainly a need for more policy support and more incentives. AGL only has limited influence over those. So there's certainly a large number of policy risks that AGL faces, and those are actually reasonably well outlined in the different scenarios in the CTAP. What we would like to see, though, is less of a focus on risk and more of a focus on what AGL might be doing to address those risks in policy settings. And unfortunately, the CTAP leaves that a little bit wanting. So I'd encourage investors to engage on that. And I suppose more broadly, something that we haven't mentioned is just the market risks. The energy market is going through enormous and very rapid change, not just in renewables build out, but challenges with transmission and changes in decentralized energy. And the policy settings, for example, from the forthcoming Nelson review, also suggest that there could be some quite significant changes coming up to address some of the weaknesses in the market as it currently exists. AGL says that it is looking for policy certainty and stability, and that's certainly very commendable and welcome, but that isn't the reality at the moment. The political stability should allow these policy settings to settle down in the next 6 to 12 months and allow AGL to move forward. But at the moment, there seems to be some hesitation as to what the future market will look like that seems to be holding back AGL from making some investments. But we very much hope that AGL will continue to be quite transparent in its disclosures about how it's assessing these policy risks going forward. I hope that begins to answer the question, but there's certainly no shortage of risks, and I'd encourage you to look at the CTAP. One of the last sections in it is about the risks that AGL sees, and it's well worth looking at. There's one further question I can see. What kind of engagement has ACCR had with AGL on its CTAP, if any? Yes, thank you for that question. We have had a long-standing engagement with AGL going back many years, and particularly intensive over the last year. We've been consulted on AGL CTAP from the start of their process, and met with them several times this year and recently since the publication of the CTAP to discuss it and get some clarification on certain areas. So we continue our engagement with the company. They are open to meeting, and would certainly encourage other investors to continue to engage on some of the areas that we've outlined and other questions that we've raised today. That concludes all the questions, and I therefore draw this webinar to a close, thanking you for your time. And if you would like to meet with us to talk further about AGL or other stocks that we're looking at, then I will be very happy to talk with you further. I can see there's just one further question about Paris alignment. Dimitri, I'm going to pass that one over to you. It looks like an excellent question.
There's a quote here. IEMO's 2023 inputs, assumptions and scenario report states that the 2024 ISP step change carbon budget is aligned to RCP 2.6, which is consistent with a temperature rise less than 2 degrees by the end of the century and in line with the Paris Agreement. What action would you recommend from stakeholders? Yeah, so this goes back to the interpretation of the Paris Agreement. That has been mentioned many times by scholars that that is quite difficult because it's not prescriptive. For me, the key here is the difference between the definition of a temperature rise less than 2 degrees and the statement in the Paris Agreement that argues for holding a temperature rise to well below 2 degrees, and that is not the same thing. So it's all about probabilities, and one can argue that a certain probability is sufficient to argue that you're limiting the temperature rise to 2 degrees, but it's all about this certainty. And if you move the certainty to lower likelihoods, it just means that you're increasing the risk of breaching 2 degrees. And that is fundamental to abiding by the Paris Agreement. So if you want to have a fairly certain way forward of limiting the temperature to 2 degrees or less at all times, then you end up at a 90% confidence interval or 90% likelihood. And so that is the real difference.
I want to elaborate a little bit on where that line around 1.8 degrees being Paris aligned comes from. AGL refers to the step change scenario being aligned with 1.8 degrees, which is an IEMO ISP scenario, so the integrated system plan. The 2024 IEMO ISP relies on the 2023 ISR, Input Assumptions and Scenarios report, and the ISR relies on the 2022 ClimateWorks CSIRO multi-sectoral modelling that shows how Australia's economy develops under specific scenarios. All scenarios include explicit emissions targets in 2030 and 2050 in alignment with Australia's current commitments under the Paris Agreement. Specifically, a net zero emissions by 2050 and a nationally determined contribution, an NDC, to reduce emissions by 43% on 2005 levels by 2030. It has been shown multiple times that that is not sufficient for the Paris Agreement. In the multi-sectoral modelling, assumptions that have to do with emissions rely on inputs that align Australia's emissions with a global 1.8 degree outcome with a 67% likelihood. It also states that the transformation in the energy sector in this scenario is in line with the less stringent temperature goal of the Paris Agreement, without stating why that is a defendable interpretation. The same report states that the deep electrification scenario, or the hydrogen export scenario, is in line with the more stringent temperature goal. So it's clear that step change can't achieve both temperature goals of the Paris Agreement, while it does call for that, holding well below 2 degrees and pursue efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And this is where this 90% certainty or likelihood comes from. I think it's important to mention that globally, the thinking about how to interpret Paris significantly ratcheted up after the release of the multi-sectoral modelling report. So it's more than understandable where this number comes from, and they are not taken out of context. They're clearly from reputable sources. But the discussion has moved on, and there is more clarity around how one should interpret the Paris Agreement, backed up by the IPCC AR6 report, as well as peer-reviewed articles addressing this question around Paris Agreement interpretation. For investors, it is important to recognize this. There's no foul intention here, but the consequence is that we inadvertently are shifting goalposts. And we see similar things pop up in the ISR 25, where different assumptions are made around the level of biological sequestration Australia will be capable of delivering. And this is the land carbon sink, or the LULUCF inventory. A greater LULUCF inventory might show that you're reducing your net emissions faster when you include that LULUCF inventory, which seems to justify greater NEM emissions. But this doesn't increase your gross emissions reductions in the energy system, which is really what decarbonisation is about. So in our view, this is really important to be mindful of.
Thank you, Dimitri. I hope that goes some way to answering the question. It's a nuanced one. In terms of the question, what action would you recommend from stakeholders? In relation to engaging with AGL, I think I would recommend asking them more specifically about the scientific evidence that they've looked at for these scenarios. And one could also look at the CTAP, where they've outlined 5 different scenarios, broadly aligned with different temperature outcomes, but they also have different policy settings. AGL identifies that its current operational plan is in line with scenario 3, which, as Dimitri has explained, is a 1.8 degree scenario, and it is not, in our view, aligned with the Paris Agreement. Scenarios 1 and 2 are much more ambitious, and it would be worth questioning AGL on how its plans would change if it were planning for a scenario 2 or a scenario 1. They've given some indications in the CTAP, but one gets the impression that they're rather content to sit with scenario 3 and what are the stretch targets that might get them to scenario 2? That's the question I'd be asking them. With that, I will thank everybody for asking their questions. I'll thank Isaac Pang, Dimitri Lafleur for joining me. Thank you all for your time. And if you would like to talk further about AGL or any of the other stocks ACCR covers, feel free to get in touch. Thank you.